BB Ukraine has now placed the logistical arteries connecting the southern front lines to the Crimean Peninsula under intense fire control. Only the Kerch Bridge remains. However, that bridge may now be the very last option Putin's army would choose for its logistical connection, because Kerch is also listed among Ukraine's next targets. In other words, for the first time since the beginning of the war, Kiev has come this close to its plan of turning Crimea into an isolated island. And behind the scenes of this strategy, a very different scenario may be waiting for us: a ground assault on the Crimean Peninsula. In fact, critical developments have taken place in recent weeks that could pave the way for the launch of such an operation. Strategic bridges connecting the peninsula to the mainland, such as Dzhankoi and Armyansk, have been targeted repeatedly. The Russian command echelon has attempted to overcome this situation and keep supply lines open by constructing alternative pontoon crossings. However, Kiev's relentless intelligence network and strike capabilities have not allowed even these makeshift bridges to remain standing. Russian military convoys attempting to pass through these routes have been rendered combat ineffective before even reaching the southern front. Moreover, these operations have been carried out using low-cost yet extremely precise autonomous drone systems, such as FPV drones. The Russian army's logistical plans in the occupied territories have been left virtually helpless in the face of Ukraine's asymmetric and cost-effective strike systems. Even the highways used by the Russian army stretching from the Rostov direction toward Mariupol are currently under heavy pressure. Feeling this pressure in the south, the Russian army has decided to withdraw some of its units even from the Kinburn Spit. The corridor extending from the south into Crimea has become an increasingly unsafe zone for Putin's forces. As a result, the picture ahead is becoming clearer and clearer. Putin's so-called unsinkable ship in the Black Sea has now begun to take on water. Kiev may ultimately deliver the final blow through a ground assault aimed at Crimea. This plan, which seemed impossible during the first years of the war, has now become a central focus for Ukraine's highest-ranking military and political officials. Key figures such as Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov and Unmanned Systems Forces Commander Robert Magyar Brovdi are sending very strong signals on this issue. For example, Mikhailo Fedorov has stated in very clear terms that Crimea is being isolated step by step through unmanned aerial systems. According to Fedorov's statements, which clearly reflect the reality on the battlefield, Ukraine is approaching the stage where Crimea can be completely cut off from the outside world. The Ukrainian minister repeatedly emphasizes that this situation could produce highly unexpected and devastating consequences for the Russian army in the operational environment. These statements strengthen the possibility of a future ground assault on Crimea. On the other hand, Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander Robert Magyar Brovdi, one of the primary architects of this strategy on the battlefield, also confirms the process. Mr. Brovdi states that after the attacks on the Russian army's logistical and energy hubs, the number of areas considered untouchable by the Kremlin is rapidly shrinking. In light of the information provided by these two critical figures, the preparation phases for a ground operation toward Crimea are becoming remarkably clear. Now, the most important question is this: how can Ukraine actually achieve it? Although a ground assault on Crimea no longer appears impossible, it would still be an extremely difficult and multi-phased operation. For that reason, Kiev may seek opportunities to launch a ground offensive toward the peninsula through preparations along several different routes. The most likely scenario is that the primary axis of attack expands from the Zaporizhzhia front through the Melitopol and Tokmak line, pushing southward toward the Azov Sea coast. This massive assault corridor is the area where the Russian army has established its heaviest minefields and fortifications, often referred to as the Surovikin line. Breaking through this line with Ukrainian armored formations has the potential to permanently and decisively split the vital land bridge connecting Russia's southern front to Crimea. Dividing this land bridge could become a crucial part of a broader plan to completely sever Russia's southern forces from one another. Signs are increasing that the next phase could involve a full-scale military push directly toward the Perekop Isthmus and the Armyansk line, because this is the narrowest, most critical, and at the same time, both the easiest to defend and deadliest to encircle land connection between Crimea and the mainland. Although the geographical structure of the Perekop Isthmus provides a tactical advantage to defenders, a military force weakened from the air and subjected to constant artillery pressure becomes highly vulnerable in such a narrow choke point. However, Kiev's leadership does not appear to rely on a single-dimensional attack plan through this narrow land corridor alone. In particular, the Sivash marshes are an area that Russian generals have long regarded as a natural barrier and therefore largely ignored. Yet they hold the potential to become a critical weak point, offering a surprise rear-flanking route for Ukraine's special amphibious forces and air assault units. An operation launched from this direction could significantly reduce the defensive options available to the Kremlin's military command in Crimea. But what about the seas? If the Ukrainian army is considering a ground operation toward Crimea, it must certainly take the Russian naval presence in the Black Sea into account, because the Kremlin's ability to respond from the sea should not be underestimated. However, these balances have changed dramatically over time. Ukraine's naval unmanned systems have already largely prevented the free movement of Russian warships and supply ferries around the peninsula. Autonomous naval platforms such as Magura and Sea Baby have become relentless hunters, continuously threatening not only Russian vessels but also critical port infrastructure. In addition, deep strikes carried out with long-range missiles supplied by allies are severely affecting radar installations and command centers deep inside the peninsula. As a result, this growing pressure gives Ukraine the opportunity to undermine Russia's ability to defend Crimea from the sea. There is probably little need to discuss how the peninsula's air defenses can be neutralized, because Kiev has already demonstrated multiple times through drone swarm tactics that it can achieve exactly that against Crimea. This asymmetric strategic pincer, combining air, land, and sea elements, is steadily advancing toward dismantling the Russian army's cumbersome defensive plans. Russian forces, forced to operate under a 360-degree threat environment where danger can emerge from any direction at any moment rather than from a single front, increasingly feel psychologically trapped within the peninsula. In other words, the Kremlin's ability to maintain its occupation of Crimea is gradually eroding day by day, and that creates far more room for Ukraine to consider a potential ground assault. In fact, globally respected strategists, such as former U.S. Army Europe Commander General Ben Hodges, have also shared critical insights on this issue. Ben Hodges argues that Ukraine's only path to liberating Crimea is to isolate the peninsula and make it operationally unlivable for Russian forces. This strategy of making Crimea unlivable, as described by Hodges, is not merely about exhausting ammunition and supplies. The general also speaks of a massive Russian garrison psychologically reaching the point of raising the white flag due to the overwhelming feeling of being trapped inside its own territory. According to Hodges's military doctrine, Ukraine's first and most critical move is to cut the Dzhankoi route and permanently remove the Kerch Bridge from the equation. Dzhankoi is the central hub where Crimea's logistical nervous system and railway network converge. Therefore, capturing or permanently placing this location under fire control could trigger the simultaneous collapse of both the eastern and western sectors of the peninsula. According to the general, the second phase is to transform Crimea into a giant trap and gradually choke enemy forces inside using precision weapons. In this strangulation campaign, heavy munitions such as ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles are highlighted as weapons capable of piercing Russia's most heavily protected underground ammunition depots and fuel storage facilities with remarkable precision. These military assets may have been reserved for the second phase of the plan because they are significantly more expensive than the standard attack drones Ukraine regularly employs. During the first phase, depleting Russian air defense missile batteries in Crimea through drone attacks is a far more cost-effective strategy. This sharp isolation plan proposed by Hodges aligns almost perfectly with the tactics Ukraine is already implementing on the battlefield. Military strategists argue that a ground assault toward Crimea can only achieve complete success if the massive Russian garrison inside the peninsula is deprived of ammunition and fuel. Otherwise, launching a direct coastal or ground assault against a fully equipped force whose logistical support remains intact carries the risk of devolving into a prolonged war of attrition. Acting in accordance with these recommendations, the Ukrainian armed forces are methodically targeting air bases, logistical facilities, and the remaining elements of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. The fact that the Black Sea Fleet has been forced to abandon repair docks and disperse into open waters is perhaps the strongest indication that any naval support that could have come from Crimea's western coastline has been effectively neutralized. In other words, Kiev is doing everything possible to close every route through which Russia could rapidly reinforce the peninsula. The attitude Russia displays in response to this situation appears increasingly disconnected from military reality. The recent response by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to Ukraine's plan of turning Crimea into an island is perhaps the clearest illustration of this strategic disconnect. Lavrov, claiming that he does not understand how Ukraine intends to implement such a plan, attempted to dismiss the situation with a mocking tone. Yet when a foreign minister ignores the destruction of billions of dollars worth of military infrastructure unfolding before the world's eyes, it reveals in full the deep communication gap between the military command fighting on the front lines and the political leadership. While bridges burn, ammunition depots explode, and fuel reserves dwindle, the Kremlin's highest-ranking diplomat claims not to understand what is happening. In reality, Russia appears unable to produce either a tactical or strategic solution capable of stopping this steadily approaching threat of a ground assault on Crimea. That is because Crimea's vast defense architecture was built on a fundamentally flawed and arrogant geopolitical assumption that the front line would never retreat to the borders of the peninsula. Now, the situation is entirely different. As a result, the Moscow administration, unable to protect logistical lines and unable to secure the skies, increasingly retreats behind abstract propaganda narratives. Yet the stories of invincibility broadcast on Russian state television can no longer conceal the kilometer-long lines at civilian fuel stations or the shortages of basic goods appearing on market shelves. Instead of implementing real solutions and developing new logistical doctrines, the Russian command appears focused solely on buying time through denial. But the unforgiving mathematics of war have already shattered the illusion created by propaganda. By the laws of physics, every anti-tank round that fails to reach the front and every attack helicopter that cannot take off makes the minefields facing Ukrainian ground forces that much easier to breach. Furthermore, Russia's decision to leave the Crimea corridor in such a vulnerable, blind, and paralyzed state creates additional operational opportunities for Ukraine. So, with all this in mind, what exactly is Russia relying on? Can it truly continue to hold Crimea as confidently as it claims? To answer that, we must first examine the Russian air defense network on the Crimean Peninsula. This defense network has been significantly eroded by Ukraine's medium and long-range drone and missile campaigns during the first half of 2026. In particular, S-400 Triumph systems, S-300 batteries, Pantsir S-1 and Pantsir S-2 systems, and various radar assets have repeatedly been targeted. According to Ukrainian sources, dozens of air defense and radar systems in Crimea have been destroyed or damaged since the beginning of 2026. These losses have weakened Russia's A2/AD capabilities over the peninsula and allowed drone swarms to penetrate deeper into the region. The Russian command is struggling to compensate for these losses. Although some radar systems and missile batteries are being repaired with spare parts or relocated from other regions, Ukraine's intelligence capabilities and strike tempo leave little opportunity for recovery. In particular, medium-range drone strikes are neutralizing extremely expensive systems at a fraction of the cost. As a result, Russian air defenses can no longer fully protect airfields such as Saki, Dzhankoi, and Tvardiske, nor can they adequately secure ports and logistical centers throughout Crimea. When examining the military units stationed within the peninsula, available resources also appear insufficient for a potential Ukrainian ground assault. Russian forces in Crimea are primarily structured for defense and logistics. Estimates suggest that between 40,000 and 60,000 fixed garrison and rotational troops are stationed there. These include ground force units, remnants of the Black Sea Fleet, air defense formations, coastal defense brigades, and Rosgvardia personnel. Formations such as the 32nd Army Corps and the 126th Coastal Defense Brigade play key roles in maintaining Russia's occupation and defending the peninsula. However, this military structure is under intense pressure. Russian units in Crimea operate under the constant expectation that they may come under attack at any moment. On the landward side, fortifications are becoming increasingly concentrated along the Perekop Isthmus, the Sivash region, and the coastal belt. Trenches, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and coastal artillery positions have all been established. Yet these defensive lines remain static and increasingly vulnerable without reliable logistical support. Ukrainian drones continue to disrupt supply convoys traveling along the R280 highway and critical railway routes. Defensive measures along Crimea's coastline also reflect a sense of urgency. Russian forces have intensified fortification efforts throughout the peninsula's coastal areas, particularly in sectors considered vulnerable to amphibious landings. As noted by naval spokesperson Dmytro Pletenchuk, the Russian command views the possibility of a Ukrainian amphibious operation as a genuine threat and is reinforcing the most vulnerable coastal zones. For that reason, Bastion P, BAL, and Rubezh mobile coastal missile systems have been deployed. These systems are intended to deter Ukrainian naval vessels and amphibious assault elements. In addition, wave barriers, floating booms, and extra air defense batteries have been strengthened around Novorossiysk. However, these fortifications remain static and passive in nature because Ukraine's naval drones have repeatedly demonstrated the ability to bypass obstacles and infiltrate port facilities. In other words, Russia's measures along the Black Sea coastline remain largely defensive and reactive. Relocating the fleet farther east may provide short-term survival, but it also increases logistical costs and reduces operational effectiveness. Alternative ports, such as Novorossiysk, are likewise within Ukraine's strike range, and attacks continue there as well. Coastal fortifications may offer partial protection against amphibious threats, but they remain insufficient against Ukraine's combined land, sea, and air pressure. All of these developments indicate that Ukraine's effort to strategically isolate Crimea and transform the peninsula into an operational burden has now reached a concrete threshold. Kiev has laid the groundwork for a realistic future ground assault by paralyzing logistical arteries, gradually establishing dominance in the air and at sea, and increasing the risk that the Russian garrison could eventually choke under its own isolation. For the first time since the war began, this process has evolved into a multi-layered pincer operation rather than a conventional frontline conflict. Through low-cost unmanned systems, precision long-range strikes, and a sophisticated use of geography, Ukraine has created asymmetric advantages even in what was once considered Russia's strongest strategic position. In the coming period, the truly critical questions will be how sustainable this isolation strategy proves to be, and at what scale, under what conditions, and with what risks Ukraine may choose to launch a ground offensive. A breakthrough operation along the Zaporizhzhia-Melitopol axis, combined with pressure on narrow corridors such as Perekop and Sivash, carries the potential to split Russia's southern forces in two. However, the ultimate deciding factor will be the speed at which Russia's logistical collapse deepens and the point at which the Crimean garrison reaches its psychological and moral breaking point. The situation is becoming increasingly difficult for Russia. Its inability to generate concrete military solutions beyond propaganda and denial, the static nature of its defensive lines, and the chronic vulnerability of its supply routes continue to narrow the Kremlin's options. The concept that once defined the peninsula as an unsinkable ship is now not only taking on water, but increasingly facing the danger of slowly sinking. In short, the strategy Ukraine is implementing is evolving into one of the most significant turning points in the war. It is a process with the potential to reshape not only the fate of Crimea, but also the geopolitical balance of the Black Sea and the broader trajectory of the conflict itself. Whatever the final outcome may be, the coming months could become the period in which this strategy is truly tested, and perhaps the period in which one of the most critical phases of the war unfolds. What do you think about this? In a scenario where Ukraine seeks to retake Crimea through a ground operation, what critical thresholds lie between the successful completion of logistical isolation and the launch of a direct assault? And what do you believe would be Russia's most likely response once those thresholds are crossed? We look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments. We also invite you to join us on YouTube, where we continue bringing you in-depth video content that makes even the longest journeys more engaging.